Okay. Good evening. My name is Jeff Arango. I am the planning director for Framework, and we have been hired to work with the city and with the community on the comprehensive plan update. And welcome to the Housing Planning Summit. This is the third in our series of events in November as part of the outreach effort for the comprehensive plan update. I'd like to introduce our other panelists for this evening. We have David Pyle, Community Development Director with the city. We have Miriam Leitner, Planning Manager with the City of Sammamish, Ellen Southard and Marin Bork, who are on the Framework team from Site Story and are helping to lead the public engagement efforts. So you'll get to see them as we move through the process, including other events. And so let me just also start with a little bit of logistics for the evening. We have a brief presentation to provide on some background on housing conditions and related planning efforts. And then, like the other events that we've had, we'll go into some live polling and some question and answer, an opportunity for comments using slido.com. So if you go on your mobile phone or on your computer to slido.com and enter in the code or use the QR code on the screen, you'll get access to be able to respond to polls and to post questions. When we get to the Q&A portion of the meeting, there's a couple of different ways that you'll be able to ask questions or provide comment. You can do it right through the Slido interface. There's a Q&A section of the app, and you can post your question there. You can also upvote other people's questions if that's something you would particularly like to hear about as well. There's also a Q&A function through the webinar that you can use to ask questions. So if you have a question or a comment, please use that. If you have a question or something going on with the webinar logistics, I have enabled the chat feature. Please try not to use that for questions just because it's less stuff for us to monitor. But if you do have an issue or anything with the presentation, you can post it there. And then finally, you'll be able to raise your hand if you'd like. And we can unmute you and give you an opportunity to make a comment or ask a question. So again, thank you so much for attending tonight, where we're going to be talking about housing, which is a really important topic for the comprehensive plan update. Okay, so this, as I said, is the third in the series of the Planning Summit events. There's two more next week. On November 14th, we'll be talking about mixed-use centers, and on November 16th, we'll be talking about transportation. All of the events are recorded, and the summary of the polling from Slido are being posted on the project website at avisionsammamish2044.org. The first two events have already been posted on the Planning Summit page, so if you're unable to attend, you can watch the video there. Okay, let's get started. So we first like to start by highlighting some related housing efforts in addition to the comprehensive plan. So for those interested in further background on housing conditions, there's the existing housing element, which was adopted in 2015 as part of the last periodic update, which is required every 8 years, now it's every 10 years. There's also Sammamish Homegrown, which was a housing strategy done between 2017 and 2019. There were two phases of development regulations updates that has housing components. There was phase 1 in 2018 and 2019, and phase 2, which was completed at the end of last year, which addressed some things like neighborhood design, site planning for residential properties, and a host of other topics. And we do anticipate to pick up additional regulation updates towards the end of the comprehensive planning process as part of the implementation effort. And then an ongoing effort is the Sammamish Housing Action Plan. It's been funded through a grant through the Department of Commerce, and the housing needs analysis has just recently been presented to the Planning Commission and it's been released. So you can look for a copy of that online, and that project will now move towards developing the actual housing action plan, which will then feed into the housing element as part of the comprehensive plan. And there's also this note at the bottom regarding participation in a regional coalition of housing called ARCH to help preserve and increase housing for low and moderate income households in Sammamish and the surrounding region. So just briefly, the current housing element, again, was adopted in 2015. There's been sort of minor updates to the comprehensive plan since then, but this is the next periodic update. And on the left-hand side, you see some of the major goals, and we will be doing a review of goals and policies a little bit later in the process, and there'll be opportunities for input on how those may get changed or revised. So some of the goals are around neighborhood vitality and kind of maintaining that character. We have a polling question about that later. Looking at the housing supply and in particular housing variety, housing affordability, housing for people with special needs, the notion of regional collaboration, which is really important, particularly around affordable housing, and then how the system is monitored and how we know that whether we're achieving our goals. And there are some additional requirements from the state regarding monitoring and reporting that I'll highlight a little bit later in the process or later in the presentation. So we've shown this slide at a couple of the previous events. These came out of the community visioning process, which was an extensive project, I think that wrapped up earlier this year. There was a statistically valid survey and a lot of really valuable input that will be informing our work in the comprehensive plan. And so these are basically the community priority kind of statements that came out of that process. And these are just kind of summarized in this diagram. But one of them specifically speaks to the need for more housing variety, choice, and affordability. So I just wanted to highlight that the community has identified that as a priority in previous outreach efforts. So some of the conditions for housing today in Sammamish, I think some of these will likely be familiar to many of you. First, there are limited options when housing needs change. So about 87% of housing units in Sammamish are single-family homes. Only 12% of housing units in Sammamish have fewer than 3 bedrooms. So as housing needs change, and we find this in many communities that we work in, longtime residents may find it difficult to meet their needs locally, may have to look outside of the community. And that can be challenging because people, often like to stay in the community that they've lived in and have friends and neighbors and a kind of a sense of community. So that is definitely an issue we want to look at. Second, housing is expensive and unaffordable to many. Obviously, many of you know that housing costs have escalated significantly in recent years, and in particular during the pandemic. And that's been particularly high on the east side outside of Seattle. So 91% of homes are valued at greater than $500,000 compared to 60% countywide. Median sale price of a home in Sammamish in 2021 exceeded $1.8 million. Finally, some people that work in Sammamish cannot afford to live in Sammamish. As part of the comprehensive plan update, we are going to be doing an economic development element, which will have some tie-ins with the housing element and sort of looking at how jobs and incomes for those that work in Sammamish match up with housing options. But 80% of workers in Sammamish jobs come from outside of the city for work, and in some cases, I think, quite a ways. That they have to travel to Sammamish to get to their jobs. So this is the current zoning map for the city, and the land use element really forms the foundation of the comprehensive plan. And it's one of the primary ways that we'll deal with any changes regarding housing, looking at the zoning map itself and the future land use map itself, but also potential changes to the standards themselves around types of units and densities, and those things are all something that we're going to explore as part of this process, and certainly in the housing action plan. So the land use pattern, in Sammamish was largely inherited from King County prior to the city incorporation in 1999. The city had been and still is to some extent using remnants of the old King County Code, although there have been significant updates at this point and will be further ones in the future. All of the yellow and orange that you see on the map is land zoned for residential. The brighter yellow is single family. And I think it's something like 94% of the city is zoned for residential development. There's limited street connectivity, although that is one thing that we addressed in the development regulations phase 2 was a stronger requirements for street connections or non-motorized connections for biking and walking. The town center sub-area plan, which is the bright area in purple on the map, adopted in 2008, was the city's first attempt to kind of diversify land use and housing stock and add services. And so that's something that's continuing to be built out over time. And then there are 3 business districts that allow for mixed use, but are currently all developed commercial. There's Pine Lake, Kalahani, and Inglewood, which is just north of the town center. So those are areas that, you know, we could look at for more of a mix of uses, potentially including housing, which is allowed under current zoning, but there is no housing directly within those commercial and mixed use districts today. Another topic that is at the forefront of the housing discussion in the state and with many communities and is part of some of the recent legislation I'll go through in a moment is what's called middle housing. So it's housing that is sort of between your typical single family or could even include small single family dwellings up to, you know, sort of larger apartment buildings. So it's, you know, oftentimes is ground related. And is sort of can take on the character of a single family home, but is a bit denser and has a bit more variety. And while it can still be somewhat expensive, it is generally more affordable than single family homes, particularly large single family homes. So this is just a range of photos of different examples of side-by-side duplexes, townhomes. The triplex example is a stacked triplex with a unit on each floor. Fourplex, which sort of has the appearance of kind of townhouse with traditional styling, and then accessory dwelling units shown there in the rear of the single family home. So these are some of the housing typologies that, you know, we'll be looking at as we move through this process. So a couple of charts on housing stock, and these charts compare Sammamish to its neighbors. So this was on a previous slide, but 87% of homes in Sammamish are single family. Similar to the town of Snoqualmie, which is 82%, but quite a bit more than some of the neighbors. So Issaquah, for example, 46% single family, Kenmore 69, Newcastle 58. And you can see the other ones there. So compared to most of the neighbors, Sammamish has a higher portion of single family homes relative to multifamily housing and other types. The cost of housing, so the cheaper, more affordable homes are on the top of the chart, and it gets more expensive as you move down into the red. So only 7% of housing options in Sammamish are between $300,000 and $500,000. The largest share at 59% is between $500,000 and $1 million, and then 32%, the highest compared to any of the peer communities we looked at. 32% are more than $1 million, and as the previous slide said earlier, the median cost is $1.8 million. Other communities, you know, seem to have wider bands of blue in some cases, and certainly some wider bands of green. You know, certainly housing is not super affordable in any of these communities, but there is a little bit of a different spread than we see in Sammamish, some cases. So housing profile, this looks at homeowners versus renters. So population from the 2020 census, about 68,000 people. 22,000, roughly 500 total housing units, and 86% of those are homeowners. So definitely a very predominant homeowner community. It's always good to have you know, a good share of homeowners, but limited opportunities for rentals as well. So this looks at cost burdened cost burden, there was a question that came into the chat I was just looking at briefly, which we'll address towards the end of the presentation. So this looks at home homeowners or renters that are cost burdened. So cost burden is generally, you're not cost burdened if you spend less than 30% of your gross income that goes towards housing costs. You're sort of moderately cost burdened if it's between 30% and 50%, and severely cost burdened if it's more than 50%. Severely cost burden between 8 and 9%, 8% for owner households, 9% for renter households. Cost burden, so that middle range of between 30 and 50, 11% for owner households, 16% for renter households, and then not cost burden, 81% and 75%. And some of that may be those that have owned their homes longer and were able to purchase them at lower cost before there was the significant escalation. And then this shows it in map form. So in red shows that between 29 and 35% of people in those areas are cost burden. In the sort of middle red pinkish color, between 18 and 30% of people within those areas are cost burden. And then the lighter areas between 12 and 18%. So there are definitely folks in the community that are experiencing, housing costs that are considered cost burden or severely cost burden. So some of the things that are going to be looked at in the housing study is looking at housing policy requirements and how to balance those with community needs and preferences. So in the housing policy requirements, we have requirements for housing for low-income households, workforce housing, and housing variety. And some of that has come out of recent legislation, as well as new county requirements that are still being worked out. On the other side are community needs and preferences. And again, some of this is what we've heard in previous outreach efforts and what we hope to hear tonight. Things like opportunities to age in place, housing that has minimal impact on the neighborhood and the things that people love about their neighborhoods, opportunities for more starter homes and variety so people can enter the housing market. So it'll be a process of sort of balancing these different requirements and community needs and preferences in Sammamish. So some of the new housing legislation and requirements on the left-hand side, there's likely to be new requirements from King County that include an affordable housing target in addition to the overall growth target. Sammamish will be required to plan for and accommodate a growth target for affordable units. We don't know exactly what that will look like. There are some scenarios that were summarized in the housing needs analysis or assessment. So you could take a look at that. One of the most significant pieces of legislation around housing is House Bill 1220, modifies the housing goal for the Growth Management Act, requiring communities to provide housing for all economic segments of the population, requirements to provide opportunities for middle housing and for affordable housing. And then House Bill 1241, which gets into kind of the monitoring and reporting, where cities are going to have to submit a report 5 years after adoption, which will kind of address progress towards implementation and meeting the goals and requirements in the comprehensive plan. So there will be a requirement for the city to report back on the comprehensive plan, including housing and progress towards meeting goals. There's the potential to be upcoming legislation as well. This just highlights 2 recent articles that talk about housing for folks experiencing homelessness and other types of kind of emergency housing. So it's definitely an ongoing situation regarding housing requirements, and we'll certainly stay informed on those and report any changes back to the community and to the city that may affect our work on the comprehensive plan. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. Just want to give another plug for the project website, envisionsammamish2044.org. Again, information from the Planning Summit series will be posted after each event. We'll also work on sort of a larger summary of the event, so we'll highlight key themes and input that we received. There's also other background information, and there's dates on there for when we'll be having events or be at the Planning Commission and things like that. And you can sign up to to get updates on that. There is a blog on the website as well. We'll probably do a blog post at the conclusion of the planning summit, directing people to the summary information and highlighting some of what we heard. So stay tuned to that. We do have use of 2 of the city's social media accounts, Instagram and Facebook, and so we'll be posting information about the comprehensive plan update on there. So I encourage you to follow the city on both of those platforms. And then contact information. If you have input or a question, don't hesitate to reach out. There's 2 email accounts that we monitor at the top, one for general info, another for comments. And then Evan Fisher, Senior Management Analyst, is the city's project manager. And then there is my own email address at Framework as well. So we want to make sure that we're accessible and available should anything come up or if you have questions. And with that, we are going to go into the Slido polling now. So if you could get on the platform by going to slido.com, using the QR code, if that's easier, and then entering the code 1205942. We have a couple of live polling exercises, and then we'll have opportunities for comments and questions. Other screen. Okay.
Jeff, if I could take a minute, I think we had a question real quick with someone in the audience about what the code was again.
Yeah, sure. Okay, there's the QR code. It's on the screen, and we can take a moment for people to sign in. So the code is 1205942. Okay. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to join. If you're having any issues, please post in the chat and we will try to do our best to help you out. So the first question is going to be a word cloud question. So as you input, it will show a word cloud and it will change as different responses are input. So we're going to make that live now. Okay, first question. What I like most about housing in Sammamish is, and you can fill in your response there and it will populate the answers on the word cloud. So the larger and words in green are those that have been mentioned in responses the most number of times. And we're starting to see, quite a bit of overlap between responses from some of the other polling exercises. So I think that's really helpful for us as we start to think about how some of these themes are interconnected, things like tree preservation, connections to nature, space, parks, greenery, woods, those are things that continue to come up, and I think are clear priorities and things that are already, I think, to some degree reflected in the current comprehensive plan, and things we can build on for this next update. Looks like there's a couple folks still typing. It'll tell us up here in the upper left-hand corner how many people are still typing. So we'll give it another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll move on to the next one. Okay, so it looks like, there's a few people typing, so I'll just kind of summarize and then we'll move on if there may be a few more responses come in. So the top responses were well-maintained, lake views, single-family homes, space, trees, trails, safety, family, near greenery. So I think there's a lot of commonality in the responses that were provided, so thank you. All right, we are going to move on to the next one, which is also a word cloud, and it's sort of the opposite. Biggest housing challenge in Sammamish is, and this could be from your own perspective or, in general for the city. Looks like affordability is clearly the top response so far. There's also some comments about needs for other types of housing, senior housing, more variety, some comments around density, but also some similar things like preserving the natural environment that we heard from in the last question. Unable to downsize is one comment. Some around the aesthetics. Few comments on the size of homes and sort of the desire to downsize. Okay, we'll give it another 30 seconds or so on this one. There's a few people looks like are still typing. Okay. We are going to move on to the third question. Thank you for those responses. The next one is also, I believe, a word cloud. So somewhat similar to maybe the first question, but more specific on your own neighborhood. Please describe the character elements that you like about your neighborhood. So lots of responses about sort of nature and habitat, community and connection with neighbors, sort of right-sized homes or appropriately scaled homes, privacy. Let's see, proximity to school and services, well-maintained, opportunities for children to play in the neighborhood. Okay. See, we have one other person responding. Just give them a second. Okay, looks like the response is in. Thank you for those responses. I think this will be, helpful as we start, looking at, any potential changes in the community relative to housing. I think these are the things that, regardless of whatever change is contemplated, are things that we want to be able to preserve, right? What people really like about their neighborhood, why they're connected to their community, I think is really important. It gives us some things to think about as we move through the planning process. All right, so the last poll is open text poll. So you'll write an individual response, and it'll show up as like a speech bubble, and it'll just scroll down the screen. And then we'll have a summary of those again available on the website following the event. So this asks in one sentence, please describe your vision for housing in Sammamish. Appreciate the honesty of one respondent who said they can't do it in one sentence. So fair enough. So been some responses that, would like to keep things the same, others looking for more kind of options, more variety. There's been some responses that talk about more housing kind of near stores or commercial areas. Connecting neighborhoods via walking and biking, mixed types, ability to move around the city without a car. Okay, we'll give it another minute or so. I know this one is takes a little bit longer to respond to. Don't fix what isn't broken. So again, another response, liking things the way they are. Maintain bedroom community. Housing for different income levels, different cultures, and at different age levels. All right. Well, if there are some people that would like more time for that response, we can leave that poll open for a little while. And show the Q&A. There's no responses in the Q&A. Let's see. Okay, well, while we'll leave the poll open for a little bit, and we can take a couple of questions and comments. First, we'll go to the Q&A in the webinar, Zoom webinar. This is more of a comment, it looks like, from Councilmember Treen. Due to the large number of waterfront homes, of course, the cost of housing on average is higher in Sammamish. That is likely true, that the number of waterfront homes would increase the average cost of housing in the city. Question from Roberto Ruiz. How do you define affordable? So there in the housing needs assessment, there is a chart that kind of defines what affordability is. I don't have those specific ranges in front of me, but it basically is all based on a percentage of the median income, which I believe from the report is about 180,000 in Sammamish. So there are different levels of affordability and ranges, and that's something I'd be happy to provide in more detail from that report. Next question, what counts for housing expense? So that would be primarily, I believe, for housing affordability, it is your housing mortgage or rent payment, insurance, things like that. I don't believe it includes things like
It,
utilities and things
well,
like that.
it for the HUD requirement, it does. So it's major
Okay.
utilities. Yep. So it's
Okay.
mortgage, insurance, major utilities.
Okay. Thank you, David. So it does include utilities as well. And again, we'd be happy to provide more detailed information on how all that is calculated. Good question. Let's see. Nothing in there. Is there anyone who would like to raise their hand and make a comment or ask a question directly? Go to the participants here and see if anyone has their hand up. Okay, do not see. Okay, Mr. Eric Johnson has a question. Never answered the time frame for the price figures in the presentation. Price of rig has been quickly and are only going down slowly. Yeah, apologies for that. So the question was for the data for the housing costs in the presentation. So let me go there. I'm going to stop my screen share for a second. Presentation. I believe most of this is from the American Community Survey, which is 5-year estimates, and it's from 2020, I believe. The source we do have listed is from the Housing Needs Assessment, so be happy to provide that in more detail, but I believe a lot of it is the American Community Survey 5-year estimates from 2020. The other data sources that are available, and you do bring up a really good point, which is there's been so much rapid change that the data has not had a chance to catch up, right? So if you're looking at like work from home numbers from 20 to 20, you know, that's probably not reflective of the change. If you look at what's called the 1-year American Community Survey estimates from 2021, you're likely to get, you know, an elevated number. And the 1-year estimates tend not to be as accurate. The other data source is the 10-year decennial census from 2020, which again would predate a lot of the impacts that we've experienced from the pandemic. And some of the data from that has not been released yet. So not all of the data is available from the 10-year census. So I believe the primary source for a lot of this is the 2020 American Community Survey 5-year estimates. There's also some data sources in the Housing Needs Assessment from the Office of Financial Management, which is a state organization and provides population projections and other data. So again, we can provide more information on that from the Housing Needs Assessment, which has all of the data sources sourced in that document.
And Jeff, if I could also add, some of the information also comes from the King County Assessor's database. So assessed values are not necessarily market values. As you may have noticed, you got a white postcard in the mail this year, about this time of year, when the county tells you your assessed value has changed. The county assessed values typically are have a bit of a lag time behind the actual market values. And it takes a while for the county to make those adjustments. I'm also happy to share, if we have a second here, the ranges of incomes by the bracketed income groups. I'm not sure that I'm able to share my screen. Let's see.
I might be able to, yep, you should be able to share now.
Great, let me go here. So this is a graphic that I created for the Planning Commission at a presentation we did.
Sorry, apologies, hit the button by accident.
Hopefully it came up. Are you able to see that, Jeff?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can see the ranges, and this comes from the 2022 HUD median family income adjusted to household size of 4. It's a percentage of adjusted median, and it represents 30% of income and includes utilities except phone. So this is information that's found on the HUD webpage that we use for calculation of rents and mortgages Arch, the a regional coalition for housing that the city is a member of, does a lot of this type of work. But you can see here, these are the brackets, 0 to 30%, 30 to 50, 50 to 80, 80 to 100, 100 to 120, and 120 and above. These are the income ranges in those brackets. And then these are the mortgages or rents that would fit in at the high end of, or excuse me, yeah, the high end of that bracket. So hopefully this helps to define what affordable is. It's also defined in state law in RCW 3670A. There were recently some amendments made to the definitions through House Bill 1220. So.
Great. Thank you, David. Looks like we have a hand up, Mr. Ruiz. I am going to unmute you and allow you to speak, and then we'll go back to any questions that are in the Q&A. Go ahead. I think you have to unmute yourself too.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I saw the brackets that you put there, David, and I guess my question is not so much as to what rent that you have to pay for each bracket, but when we define affordability, are we talking about providing housing that is going to be affordable for every single bracket? Does that mean that we have to provide housing that is going to be affordable for people who make less than $30,000 a year?
So based on what we're seeing from House Bill 1220, which was passed last summer, and what we're seeing from those changes that were made to the revised Code of Washington in Chapter 3670A, which includes elements that are necessary to be addressed in your comprehensive plan. And based on how that is then passed down to the county and what the county is doing regarding regional need for housing and looking at how to assign targets to each jurisdiction, it appears that we are going to be receiving a target of around 1,400 units in the 0 to 30% AMI range, and about, I want to say, 400 units in the 30 to 50 range, and I think 200 in the 50 to 80. Don't quote me on that. Something in that range. And what the city is responsible to do is to plan for and accommodate those units in those ranges. The city is not responsible to build those units, but we have to demonstrate that we have adjusted our policies and our development regulations and have identified programs to assist in any way possible to plan for and accommodate those units in those bracketed income ranges by 2044. So the target is 1,400 units in the 0 to 30% range by the year 2044. And we have to have a plan that is acceptable to the county, the regional planning authority, the Puget Sound Regional Council, and the Washington State Department of Commerce, who is responsible for implementing that state law change under House Bill 1220. We have to have that in our comprehensive plan, and it has to be something that is reviewed and certified by December of 2024. We have to be able to demonstrate how we're going to accommodate that. Hopefully that made some sense. It's a lot of policy jargon, so I apologize if it's a complicated answer. It's a complicated topic.
It makes sense, but that raises other questions, and that is there any land available for development that is owned by the city of Sammamish, or is it all land that is privately owned right now?
So it is all land that is privately owned. And again, the city is supposed to find ways to help incentivize property owners to build this. There are other options that the city will be considering, like what's called a multifamily tax exemption program. We'll be looking at that. We'll be looking at transfer of density rights and how we can take some of the properties in the city that are privately owned that are maybe not developable, where there's a lot of wetlands or steep slopes or other types of constraints that are really not appropriate for development, and to be able to transfer the density or the units that could have gone on those properties to other properties where they are more appropriate, and maybe even adding some kind of a multiplier, so you could, instead of getting 2, maybe you get 4 or maybe even 8, if you're building at certain levels of affordability. It's also important that we analyze our development patterns. So the slide that Jeff showed, where it shows the zoning and the commercial areas and the roads, we want to make sure to analyze how to incentivize this type of growth in these different more diverse housing types and different income groups in areas that also have access to services. We don't want to always have to have everybody get in their car to drive to the store, right? So how do we find ways to grow as a community, meet the state requirements, meet the county requirements, and do it in a way that is smart as a community and doesn't necessarily impact a lot of our existing wonderful single family neighborhoods?
And what would the penalties be if we don't meet those county and state requirements?
Yeah, so again, the state requirement, they've been very clear about this, because I think they've heard back from a lot of cities that this is something that's just infeasible. And they made it very clear that the cities aren't expected to physically build the housing. We just need to plan for and accommodate it. We need to try to find a way to incentivize it, to work with potential builders and property owners to make it happen. If we don't update our plan in a way that is acceptable to King County, to the Regional Planning Authority, Puget Sound Regional Council, and to the Washington State Department of Commerce, who represents the state, then what happens is we don't have a certified comprehensive plan. We don't have a plan that is seen as legitimate. We're considered out of compliance, and we then could be subject to restrictions on grant funding that we receive, other types of funding, and ultimately the state and the governor's office could impose sanctions on the city that would cut off quite a few of our funding sources through many of the tax structures that Washington State has and the revenue routing that we receive from the state.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Thanks, David. Thank you, Mr. Ruiz. Next up, James Eastman. Mr. Eastman, go ahead.
Yeah, on these 0 to 30% units, is there a square footage limit? I mean, could you just build micro units and fulfill that mandate, or do they have to be 1,500 square foot units?
I don't believe there is a square footage limit. So I think obviously smaller units is part of the affordability. It would depend on family structures and stuff in terms of whether it was meeting all those needs. But my understanding is there is not a square footage requirement for those units.
I'll add, though, that there is an equity component. So we want to make sure that we're not creating disparity in the market and inequity issue. I agree with what Jeff said. However, we also at the same time can't necessarily create income segregation, so to speak. So we need to be mindful of that as well as we plan to accommodate this type of development in the city going forward.
Absolutely. Thank you. Next, we have Eric Johnson. Mr. Johnson, go ahead.
Okay. David Powell was describing quite a bit of some of the questions I had of this, because currently building is done by someone acquiring land, a company or person, or buying up an existing home, ripping it down and then rebuilding something else, or somebody coming to the asking for permits to build a set of lots. And the goal is maximum return on investment. It's no consideration whatsoever by how it fits in with the neighborhood, whether it's got a dead end hammerhead or whether it's got actual connection to other streets. And it's the ability to control and regulate that is going to be extremely difficult with the current building environment and how things are planned. The goal is wonderful, is to have to integrate things within a community and have multiple varieties of levels of people, level of housing in areas. But I don't know, it sounds very difficult.
Thank you for those comments. I mean, certainly, I think as David highlighted in some of his responses, and it's definitely a challenge that many communities are going through, and there's new requirements that we're going to have to sort through, and try to do the best that we can, understanding that there isn't a perfect playbook to achieve some of these goals. So we'll have to all work together to try to put the best foot forward.
And adding on to what Jeff said, there was a component in the presentation that he did that identified a reporting time frame. So one of the things that we're going to have to do is to track and report out on our progress against our comprehensive plan goals, and see how our policies and our development regulations and zoning controls are working. And if they're not achieving the intended outcome, then we may be asked by the state to consider making some amendments to those policies and development regulations. So that's also new this year, is that we're now tracking our progress towards those goals and targets. And if we're not making progress, well, then we're going to be asked to assess why we're not making progress. And you raise a very inherent complication around us trying to convince, if you will, the development community to build these types of units in the city, when traditionally the target for the development community has been maximum return. It's a business, I get it, I'm not trying to fault them, but their focus has been, as a business model, on maximum return.
Thank you, David. We're going to give Mr. Lloyd Warren the opportunity to speak, and then we'll go back to the questions that were in Slido and in the Q&A on Zoom. So, Mr. Warren, go ahead.
Thanks. I think some of the conversation has been appropriate about there is a cost to making housing affordable, which is somewhat oxymoronic, but you either have to subsidize it heavily, or, as you said, incentivize. And usually when you incentivize, you either have to regulate how much certain units can be bought and sold for. And usually the trade-off to that is a developer then is allowed to sell more houses at higher prices. So in essence, you exacerbate the issue of higher price housing. And if you think about it philosophically, the reason housing prices are high here is not necessarily because it costs any more to build a house here, just the building cost. It's all the quality of the environment, the quality of the schools, the sense of the community, safety, and quality services. Although development regulation makes housing very expensive here also. But if you all of a sudden then if it starts to become affordable in kind of a free market sense, it's because we don't have those same values anymore. So if we create housing that maintains all these high qualities, people will continue to pay very high prices for the housing in this community. So it's somewhat self-defeating in a way. So that's going to be a real challenge. The second point I wanted to make was I'm a big advocate for looking at workforce housing, because workforce housing really kind of focuses on the people that are already here, that are working here, can't afford to work here. As a member of the Sammamish Plateau Water District, I've been having discussions with other government agencies that have workers that just can't afford to live here. So how do we collaborate together potentially to create affordable housing for those people that are already here in essence? And it helps reduce the amount of additional services that we need for people that aren't here yet. If we bring those in, then we have to provide more transportation services that aren't, and other services that the people in essence are using this community are already using. So I think I haven't heard anything about that. So I think there's some different ways that we can think about this, but I think there's a huge challenge to attain an affordability. There's no challenge to getting mixed units, different types of housing. It's the question of affordability and how you do that. Thanks.
Thank you for those comments. Really, I think-
Thank you for the comments. The one so we definitely will be wanting to talk to our service provider counterparts and some of the employers in the city to talk about that exact topic, workforce housing. An example of that is the city of Kirkland went through a process I can't remember if they actually implemented it, but they were working on an implementation plan to build housing for city staff in the city of Issaquah, or excuse me, in the city of Kirkland. There are some other parallel conversations that are happening regionally and locally around different funding mechanisms. There are two funding mechanisms that have stood out and are being discussed on different regional forums and local forums. One is a affordable housing levy, and that's under RCW 8452-105, and it allows for a local jurisdiction to pass a levy to help fund affordable housing. Another one is there's consideration of some changes to the state REIT structure, the real estate excise tax structure, that would help provide for some designated funding streams related to affordable housing. So those are some considerations on the funding end, but I do agree with many of those comments. So thank you for the feedback.
Okay, thank you. We're going to just take a couple of the questions that were in Slido. I can share my screen so people can see it as well. So first is a question around homeless shelters. There is requirements for communities to provide what's called emergency housing, and homeless shelters certainly could be part of that conversation. Next was, please inform the community on the benefits of TDR. So TDR is transfer of development rights. The city does have an existing TDR program. I think, in fact, two TDR programs, one that works with the town center and another that is related to the county program. And essentially, transfer of development rights preserve certain areas by sending the development rights of what are called sending sites, or the areas that are to be preserved, to another location, and allows for more development in exchange for purchasing those development rights. So it provides an incentive both for conservation efforts and for things like potentially housing or affordable housing goals. And I know there's ongoing discussions at the city level around the future of the TDR program. So if you're interested in that, stay tuned. Question, what was the average median price for 2021 in the presentation? Was it 1.8 million or another number? It was 1.8 million. I believe that actually came from Redfin data. I'm remembering now because there's a really interesting chart that is in the housing needs assessment that looks at housing costs and housing supply on a monthly basis. And I believe that number is from Redfin. Next question, was that 1,400 units of affordable housing in the smallest income bracket? Yes, I believe that's what has come out of some of the county discussions. Again, that's kind of to be determined. And then I think this was a follow-up. What percentage of all housing units in Sammamish would that be? If the question is what percentage of overall units, it would be about 5%. If it's a question of percentage of our housing target, which is just over 2,000, it would be, 70% or so. I can't do the math on that in my head perfectly, but it would be a very high percentage. So next question, how can below market housing attract developers without subsidy? Who pays the subsidy? So I can start on this one. David may have some things to add. There's a lot of different models for how you attract affordable housing. David kind of alluded to incentives in the development code, things like inclusionary housing, where there's basically an upzoning process to allow more units to be built if some of those, a couple of those are affordable. In my experience, the economics of the incentives really have to be fine-tuned in order to get that to work. I have seen communities have things like incentive zoning on the books for affordable housing, but because the incentive wasn't in line with the market, not much happened. I think it can also happen more commonly in larger cities where there's more development happening as part of one project. And it tends to be more things that are closer to workforce housing because of the economics. When you're looking at housing that is 0 to 30% of AMI, you're looking at typically affordable housing developers where that's typically what they're focused on. And there could be additional subsidies, like some communities that have had surplus properties have offered it to affordable housing developers for development. So there's a subsidy that way. They may be getting federal grants and things to subsidize the cost. So the subsidy can come from a variety of places. David mentioned like a housing levy that some communities like Bellingham have done, where there's more of a direct role of like a housing agency, building housing. So there's a variety of formats in how you do it. And I think those are all things that we'll be exploring as part of the housing plan and as part of the comp plan. And then the last, or just a comment to please prioritize TDR.
I can respond to that. So our city council does have a priority in our budget for 23 and 24 to analyze the city's existing TDR program, make changes to our interlocal with King County, and to find ways to work on and activate an internal city TDR program. So we will be taking that on starting in the beginning of 23, and we look forward to that work. It's a program that's sat idle for a while, and we think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, thanks, David. Couple of other questions I don't think we answered. When will we see some potential strategies? So I think you're likely to first see strategies around housing coming out of the Housing Action Plan. So again, project is just sort of moving into the kind of strategy and plan development phase. We will have a goal and policy review for the housing element. That'll probably happen in the first half of next year. So there'll be opportunities for comment on that. And then, those will be refined within the housing element and the housing action plan. I believe the housing action plan has to be completed by the middle of next year. So that gives you, I think, a sense of the timeline on that. And
I see
then
Miriam has a hand up on that. She might have something to add.
Yeah, please go ahead, Miriam.
Sorry, I was just going to add for the Housing Action Plan on December 8th from 6 to 7 p.m. We'll be having a virtual event where we'll start talking about strategies for the housing plan and asking for community input. So we'll have more information up on the Envision Sammamish 2044 website pretty soon.
Thanks, Miriam. And we just did launch today a page specifically on housing. There's a new link at the top of the website that says elements, and there'll be eventually a page on each of the element topics, but there's already one that we've started on housing. So there's some background on the housing action plan, and they'll be updated as new things become available. Let's see, there is one other question. Will you address the town center? So I mean, the town center is certainly mentioned within the comprehensive plan. So there is the potential to take a look at the goals and policies around the town center. It's also subject to a specific sub-area plan, of which is not within the scope of work here. So it is, I think, a topic of conversation. I can't say there's anything necessarily major on the agenda at this point in terms of potential changes there, but certainly open to input and feedback on the town center. And then regarding expectations of folks who expect to live and work in Sammamish, how many actual retail service storefront jobs are actually available in the city? So good question. We are going to be working on the city's first economic development element as part of this effort. And so that'll be, looking at data that will help us answer that question. But in the meantime, we do have some from demographic and census information on economic conditions and sort of the number and types of jobs in Sammamish. If you go to the Sammamish Today tab on the project website, there's one, I think there's 2 reports related to economic conditions, and I believe one of them has a chart that shows the breakdowns of types of jobs. There's roughly 7,000 jobs total in the city, and there's a breakdown by type in there as well.
Jeff, I do see one question in the chat, in the Zoom chat, is can
Okay.
you also waive impact fees from affordable housing units? The answer is yes, you can. That is something that is completely on the table here. That does also present a service challenge for service providers like the school districts, because they do rely on revenue for new students for brick and mortar facility construction. So we really want to make sure to include all of the service providers and stakeholders in that to make sure we understand what those impacts might be if they were to be waived.
Thank you, David. Okay, I think we've gotten all the questions. Anyone else want to make a comment or ask a question? We have a few more minutes if we need it. Let's check here. Check the Slido. So there is one question in Slido. It said, you said the city won't pay for affordable housing. It sounds like we will pay in the form of increased density or other concessions to enable development. I mean, as David just said, there could be some service costs, but the city is not required to directly, pay for affordable housing. And these are some of the things that we'll look at in the land use alternatives, including potential regulatory and other strategies that could help incentivize and meet the state and regional requirements for affordable housing. In addition to, as David said, meeting with the service providers to see, how any incentives might impact their operations and the operations and costs of the city and the residents. So something we're mindful of, but you are correct. There won't be direct payments by the city or development for affordable housing. Okay. Okay, looks like Paul Stickney would like to make a comment. I'm going to give you the floor. Go ahead, Mr. Stickney.
Howdy, Jeff. Howdy, David.
Hi.
Appreciate all the information this evening, and thanks for letting me know that was Redfin that came up with the 1.8. I've tracked across the NWMLS because I'm an agent. The number of sales in Sammamish every year since 2000. And of course, MLS does not cover all sales because some people sell on their own. Anecdotally, I would guess that the Northwest Multiple Listing covers roughly 90% of sales. Interesting, in 2021, there were 1,437 sales across Sammamish, and the median price was $13.59. Ran the number in 2022 in August the first time, and there were 609 sales with a median income of $16.50, so a pretty significant increase. But interesting, just as of today, that number has gone to 876 sales, so roughly 270 more, but the price has dropped to 1,550. So just some interesting information I just thought I would share.
Yeah, appreciate that. It would be also interesting to look at the impacts of interest rates, because housing has gone down, but the actual cost, for those that are financing continues to climb. But definitely something that we'll, want to continue to track, because again, things appear to be changing so quickly. So thank you, Mr. Stickney, for that information. Appreciate it. Let's see, there is a question in the chat. Will planning consider development regulations? And the answer to that is yes. We do have within our scope to look at regulations. The end of last year, we did, I think, one of the largest overhauls, at least with respect to residential development, looking at standards for neighborhood design and site planning standards for residential developments, and absolutely development regulation updates. We have a list of topics that we identified at the end of phase 2 that we want to kind of circle back to, but also anything else that comes out of the comprehensive plan update will move forward towards the end of the process. Will regulators protect trees? There is already a fairly robust standards for tree protection that predated certainly the phase 2 project. We also did address that topic somewhat in the neighborhood design standards, so for larger scale projects, and those standards I think are always looked at and continue to be refined as needed and as things come up as projects are reviewed. But definitely tree protection standards are in place today.
If I could add to that, we are also working on a greenhouse gas reduction and vehicle miles traveled reduction strategy, as well as we will be working on development of a climate action plan and a climate change and resiliency element in the comprehensive plan. One of the components of that is, and this is consistent with what's happening regionally, nationally, internationally, is a push to migrate to electrifying our energy sources. So for home heating, cooking, for our vehicles, etc. So one of the challenges that we have is that if we're going to be electrifying our homes and our vehicles and trying to change the way we power our lives, that there is a conflict between trees and power lines. I think many of us saw that in the past week's windstorms, and there were many residents who were without power for extended periods or on several occasions within a short time frame. So I do want to raise that, as we start to look at some of these strategies to electrify our lives, we do also want to consider how trees interplay with our electrical grid. Undergrounding electrical wires is cost prohibitive and is really off the table. It's not something that is attainable for us. So we do want to talk about how to best augment our grid for redundancy, interconnectedness, resiliency, different types of wires, and also creating tree clear zones around our wires and doing tree risk assessments around our electrical grid. So just want to point that out. I know that trees are a very complicated topic in the community, but as we identify other priorities, we do need to consider alternative approaches to managing trees.
Thank you, David. A couple final questions, comments that I want to highlight that came in on the Slido, and then we'll be just out of time. Looks like a comment: the city does have land for dwelling units, 240 in the town center. Next is a question. Are you going to recommend changes in development regulations to incentivize construction of affordable housing, such as reducing the minimum lot size, density bonuses, elimination of parking requirements? I would say we're not, at the point where we have a clear sense of what we're going to recommend. There's a lot of work to do before we get to that, but certainly the things that are listed are topics of discussion and, frequently what communities might look at as a way to incentivize affordable housing. But, there's also other opportunities as well. Some of these topics were addressed to some degree in the development regulations phase 2, where it was a community priority to sort of right size the size of parcels or lots with the size of homes. But we did have some incentives in there for things like ADUs and duplexes, typologies that are allowed in the code, but we have not seen significant production of to date. So again, I think everything's on the table, but we're certainly not at the recommendation stage yet. Comment, protect the understory for the trees is necessary too. Clear cut and lawns are not healthy environments. Thank you. Does this study look at increased crime with increased density? I do not believe that'll be something that we will look at. We certainly, as part of the land use alternatives, will look at the impacts on services and on infrastructure from any potential land use changes, including potential changes to density. Underground ingredients, all but high voltage are doable. Thank you for that. I think that's related to what we were just talking about. And I think that is it in the Slido. Make one more check here in the Q&A and see if there's any other comments. Let's see. Oh, looks like there's some stuff here. I'm glad to see the climate action plan and work on climate change. Thank you for that comment. Instead of cutting new land, is there any conversation to building up the already built 3 commercial centers that currently offer the footprint to build multi-use, multi-levels versus just 1 story? Kalani, Pine Lake, and Inglewood. Thank you for that plug for Monday's Planning Summit session, where we will be talking about that exact topic. So the title of that session is called Mixed Use Centers, and we'll be doing an overview of those kind of conditions in those 3 centers, providing some examples or precedents from other kind of similar type developments in the region and elsewhere. So if you're interested in that topic, I'd encourage you to attend. Again, the zoning does allow some housing in those areas, but it has not been built to date. Comment, has Commissioner Franz's Keep Washington Evergreen Tree Plan and Saving Old Growth Trees helped at all with the ongoing clear cuts and developments? I am not totally clear if the city has been looking at that plan at all. I can say that we did address the integration of natural features and preservation of trees as part of the phase 2 development regulations and the neighborhood design standards. And again, the city already has a good set of tree protection standards in their code as well. All right, well, we are just at our time, so I'm gonna thank everyone for attending the meeting. This was a great discussion, lots of good comments and questions. I appreciate everyone taking the time to attend and fill out the polling exercises. The video and the responses will be posted on the website shortly. If you have any questions or follow-up, please don't hesitate to reach out, and I encourage you to let your neighbors know, your friends and neighbors, about the Planning Summit events, and if they're interested in any of the 2 remaining topics, I encourage you to attend. And we'll also be at some of the upcoming Planning Commission and City Council meetings on various topics, so encourage you to take a look at that as well if you're interested. And other than that, have a great evening, and really appreciate your attendance tonight.